The Silver Surfer can survive a black hole due to his cosmic energy-powered physiology, allowing him to withstand immense gravitational forces. But he's not the only one. Thanos has survived a black hole by using the Infinity Gauntlet to manipulate space-time and escape its gravitational pull. These characters have unique powers and the complex mythology of the Marvel Universe. Let's explore the incredible ways they've defied the odds and emerged from the void. The Silver Surfer's survival of a black hole was inspired by the real-world concept of cosmic strings, which are theoretical topological defects in space-time. This concept was first introduced by Stan Lee in an interview in 1978. Thanos' survival in the Infinity Gauntlet series due to concerns about its scientific accuracy. However, Jim Starlin's vision for the story ultimately prevailed, and the scene has become an iconic moment in Marvel history. Doctor Strange's magical abilities, specifically the Eye of Agamotto, have allowed him to navigate and survive a black hole. However, his methods have been inconsistent across different comic book series, with some depicting it as a simple spell and others as a complex ritual. The Hulk's immense strength and durability enabled him to survive the gravitational forces of a black hole in the comic book series Hulk. This feat is proof of his unique physiology, which allows him to adapt to extreme environments. Thor, with his Asgardian physiology and Mjolnir, has survived a black hole by using his hammer to create a wormhole and escape. This feat was depicted as a test of his worthiness to wield Mjolnir, with the hammer serving as a focal point for his escape. Galactus, as a cosmic entity, can survive a black hole due to his immense power and ability to manipulate energy. This feat is proof of his role as a force of nature in the Marvel Universe. The Phoenix Force, which is bonded with several characters including Jean Grey, can survive a black hole due to its immense cosmic energy. This ability is a key aspect of its cosmic power, with the ability to manipulate energy on a universal scale. Quasar, with his quantum bands, has survived a black hole by using his bands to create a quantum shield and protect himself from its gravitational forces. This feat is proof of his ability to use his technology to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. Annihilus, with his advanced technology and suit, has survived a black hole by using his suit to create a localized distortion of space-time. This feat is a demonstration of his strategic thinking and ability to outmaneuver his opponents. The ability of these characters to survive black holes is not just proof of their individual powers, but also a reflection of the complex and ever-evolving mythology of the Marvel Universe. The depiction of black holes in Marvel Comics has been influenced by real-world scientific discoveries, with writers incorporating concepts such as gravitational waves and Hawking radiation into their stories. The use of black holes as a plot device in Marvel Comics has allowed writers to explore complex scientific concepts in a fictional context, making the stories more engaging and thought-provoking. The Marvel Comics universe has established a set of rules for surviving black holes, with characters typically requiring a combination of physical and energetic protection to withstand the intense gravitational forces. The consequences of surviving a black hole have been depicted as severe, with characters often emerging with physical and psychological scars. The survival of characters in black holes has been used to explore the concept of the multiverse, with some stories depicting characters emerging in alternate realities or dimensions. The Marvel Universe's exploration of black holes has also been used to explore deeper mythological themes, such as the concept of the void and the nature of existence, reflecting the creator's intent to use science fiction as a metaphor for human experience. According to an interview with Dan Slott, the depiction of black holes in Marvel Comics has been influenced by the work of theoretical physicists such as Stephen Hawking and Kip Thorne, who have consulted with writers on the accuracy of their portrayals, highlighting the creator's commitment to scientific accuracy. The concept of characters surviving black holes has its roots in the Silver Surfer's first encounter with a black hole in Fantastic Four number 72, which was inspired by the real-world concept of cosmic strings, a theoretical topological defect in space-time, as revealed in an interview with Stan Lee. Over the years, the concept of black hole survival has undergone several retcons and revisions, with some stories depicting it as a simple feat and others as a complex and difficult challenge, reflecting the evolving nature of the Marvel Universe and the need to adapt to changing scientific understanding. Despite the fantastical nature of the Marvel Universe, the depiction of black holes has been praised for its scientific accuracy, with concepts such as gravitational waves and Hawking radiation being incorporated into the stories, demonstrating the creators' commitment to grounding their fiction in real-world science. To achieve this level of scientific accuracy, Marvel Comics writers have consulted with experts in the field, including physicists and astronomers, to ensure that their depiction of black holes is as realistic as possible, given the fictional context, as revealed in an interview with Brian Michael Bendis. However, the survival of characters in black holes is not just a physical challenge, but also an emotional one, with many characters emerging from the experience with deep-seated psychological scars, highlighting the human cost of such an event. The emotional toll of surviving a black hole has been depicted as severe, with characters often struggling to come to terms with the trauma they have experienced and the consequences of their survival. The exploration of black holes in Marvel Comics has also led to a deeper understanding of the characters and their place in the universe, with many stories using the concept as a metaphor for exploration and discovery, highlighting the boundless possibilities of the Marvel Universe. The depiction of black holes has also given readers a cosmic perspective on the Marvel Universe, highlighting the vastness and complexity of the universe and the characters' place within it. The relationship between characters and black holes is complex and multifaceted, with some characters using them as a source of power, while others see them as a threat to the stability of the universe, highlighting the diverse range of perspectives within the Marvel Universe. The use of black holes as a source of power has also raised questions about the responsibility that comes with such power, with some characters struggling to wield it effectively, and others using it for personal gain. The consequences of surviving a black hole have been depicted as far-reaching, with some characters emerging with new powers or abilities, while others are left with lasting scars, highlighting the unpredictable nature of such an event. The unpredictable nature of black holes has also been used to create unexpected plot twists and surprises, keeping readers on the edge of their seats and highlighting the dynamic and ever-changing nature of the Marvel Universe. The influence of black holes on the Marvel Universe has been profound, with many characters and storylines being shaped by the concept and the themes and ideas it represents. The themes and ideas represented by black holes, such as the nature of existence and the concept of the void, have been explored in depth, adding depth and complexity to the Marvel Universe, and highlighting the creator's commitment to exploring the human condition. The representation of black holes in Marvel Comics has been varied and diverse, with different artists and writers bringing their own unique perspective to the concept, highlighting the creative freedom and experimentation that defines the Marvel Universe. The artistic interpretation of black holes has also been a key aspect of their representation, with many artists using the concept as a chance to push the boundaries of their craft and create innovative and visually stunning depictions of the phenomenon. The legacy of black holes in Marvel Comics is a lasting one, with the concept continuing to inspire and influence new stories and characters, and shaping the future of the Marvel Universe. The future influence of black holes on the Marvel Universe is likely to be significant, with many upcoming storylines and characters being shaped by the concept and the themes and ideas it represents, highlighting the enduring impact of the Marvel Universe's exploration of black holes. The impact of black holes on the Marvel Universe has been profound, with the concept changing the course of many characters' lives and shaping the destiny of the universe. The concept of destiny and fate has also been explored in the context of black holes, with some characters seeing the phenomenon as a test of their worthiness, and others as a chance to shape their own destiny, highlighting the complex and multifaceted nature of the Marvel Universe. The mythology of black holes in Marvel Comics has been built up over many years, with many stories and characters contributing to the concept's richness and depth, highlighting the creator's commitment to crafting a complex and immersive universe. The cosmic stories of Marvel Comics have been shaped by the concept of black holes, with many tales of adventure and exploration being set against the backdrop of the phenomenon, highlighting the boundless possibilities of the Marvel Universe. The experience of surviving a black hole has been depicted as a transformative one, with many characters emerging from the experience with a newfound appreciation for the universe and their place within it. The transformative power of black holes has also been used to explore the concept of personal growth and development, with many characters undergoing significant changes as a result of their experience, highlighting the potential for transformation and renewal in the Marvel Universe. The connections between black holes and other concepts in the Marvel Universe, such as wormholes and alternate dimensions, have been explored in depth, highlighting the complex and interconnected nature of the universe. The interconnected nature of the Marvel Universe has been highlighted by the concept of black holes, with many stories and characters being linked by the phenomenon, demonstrating the creator's commitment to crafting a cohesive and immersive universe. The innovation and creativity of the Marvel Universe's exploration of black holes has been a key aspect of the concept's success, with many writers and artists using the phenomenon as a chance to push the boundaries of their craft and create new and exciting stories. The emphasis on creativity and innovation in the Marvel Universe's exploration of black holes has been a driving force behind the concept's enduring popularity, with many fans appreciating the unique and imaginative approach to the phenomenon. The enduring legacy of black holes in Marvel Comics is proof of the concept's power and versatility, with the phenomenon continuing to inspire and influence new stories and characters, and shaping the future of the Marvel Universe. The future of the Marvel Universe is likely to be shaped by the concept of black holes, with many upcoming storylines and characters being influenced by the phenomenon and the themes and ideas it represents, highlighting the enduring impact of the Marvel Universe's exploration of black holes. The revelation of the Marvel Universe's exploration of black holes is a complex and multifaceted one, with many themes and ideas being explored in depth, highlighting the creator's commitment to crafting a rich and immersive universe and the boundless possibilities of the Marvel cosmos. The boundless possibilities of the Marvel cosmos are rooted in the concept of black holes, which has been expertly woven into the fabric of the universe by creators like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who initially faced skepticism from editors but persevered to bring this sci-fi element to the forefront of the comics. One notable example of character-specific innovation is Quasar's use of his quantum bands to survive a black hole, as seen in Quasar number 10, which not only highlights his resourcefulness, but also showcases the versatility of the Marvel Universe's approach to black hole survival, often incorporating real-world scientific concepts like quantum mechanics. The inspiration behind the Marvel Universe's depiction of black holes comes from a mix of scientific inquiry and creative vision, with writers like Dan Slott drawing from the work of theoretical physicists such as Stephen Hawking and Kip Thorne to craft compelling and thought-provoking stories that explore the complexities of the cosmos. However, the consequences of surviving a black hole have not been without controversy, with some storylines, such as the Hulk's survival in Hulk number 14, being subject to retcons and revisions over the years, reflecting the ongoing evolution of the Marvel Universe and its commitment to refining its mythology. Beyond the mechanics of survival, the Marvel Universe's exploration of black holes has delved into deeper themes, such as the concept of time dilation, as seen in Fantastic Four number 172, where the characters experience time at different rates, and the idea that surviving a black hole can be a transformative and life-altering experience. The influence of black holes on future storylines is evident in the way they have become a catalyst for exploring complex scientific concepts and their implications on the universe, with upcoming stories likely to continue this trend, incorporating real-world scientific discoveries and theoretical concepts to create a rich and immersive narrative. The Marvel Universe's depiction of black holes has also been influenced by real-world scientific discoveries, such as the detection of gravitational waves and the observation of Hawking radiation, which have been incorporated into the comics to add a layer of authenticity and depth to the storytelling, reflecting the ongoing dialogue between science and science fiction. Join us next time on Hero Lore as we explore more fascinating topics in Marvel Comics. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analysis and exciting content. And if you have any questions or topics you'd like to discuss, leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching.